Today, I have the pleasure of interviewing Andrew Sheldon, known to Sheldon Genealogy's treasurer, Sue Sheldon, as Uncle Andy. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you. Thanks very much for having me.
Oh, our pleasure. I thought to get started, I would ask you to tell us about which Sheldon progenitor line you come from, and if you have any interesting stories in your family tree that connect with your own.
Oh, I love to go all the way back to York. I think last Father's Day, I posted that skeleton in York as an homage to my father.
Well, actually, that is connected to your to the York. You do have a connection with the supposed headless gladiators of York.
Really?
Yes.
So, okay, okay. Well, okay, then good. That's good. Good. We can go on. Before we get too much further, I just want to say to you, Kelly, and to Sue, that I am just so grateful for the work you all are doing. It has provided me with a link to history that I never would have had otherwise. I was one of those students of history that paid attention very little to the list of dates and the rulers and the places. You know, geography was more important than history for sure, until I went to Deerfield. And then all of a sudden, everything unfolded for me, and it was amazing to learn from a very personal point of view. So thank you both very much.
Well, thank you for that. And I think the power of genealogy is the personal connection. And it's too bad that when we're studying history, that we don't have that kind of connection to make it real to us. Because frankly, I agree with you, a bunch of names, dates, and places that I had to memorize in order to pass a history test just didn't quite cut it for me.
That's right. Your question was about my progenitor, and I guess I have a note that Sue helped me with one time. It says Isaac, and afterward it says 5.
Yes.
And then John 2, Remembrance 3, 4, Roger 5.
Anywhere between Deerfield and where you are right now that you have some connections, you know, father, grandfather, great-grandfather, or whatever, that had anything to do with social justice, because I know that that's a very driving interest for you.
Oh, well, you know, it's interesting because in the Deerfield crew family, I should say, we have slave owners. There was a relative who I believe lived in Windsor, who, if I remember correctly, had 5 slaves. And that was also about the time that members of the family were captured and became slaves. So it's very interesting to me in my study, my research into slavery and the aftermath, that we're on both sides of that issue.
Right. Very interesting. And so was this knowledge something that came later, or is this something that you've known about for a long time?
Came later.
Okay.
Came later as I dug into the Deerfield and just went ahead with my research and my work. It suddenly meant other people who were dealing with the discovery that they had slaves in their families, slave owners who were relatives. And I started thinking about it. Well, maybe we do too. I better look at that. So, you know, beyond Dances with Wolves, which was sort of progenitor to the story about Ensign John going up and trying to retrieve the children. There was a good deal of interest on my part in all of that.
Yeah, mine, I knew because a great uncle had done research on southern part of my family, and I knew that there were slave owners there. But I got a bit of a surprise when my DNA revealed that I had African ancestry, likely coming through a woman in the tree. And so again, both sides of the equation and reconciling that you have the victim and the perpetrator in your tree, part of your background.
Yeah.
And most people
It's-
who have ancestry that goes back in this country are going to be faced with some version of that story somewhere along the line. So maybe we'll shift gears a little bit and talk about where you went to school and what you started off studying and what your career aspirations in the beginning were.
The school question is much easier than the other one. So let's go there. Graduated from high school in Coral Gables, Florida, went to Emory University where I studied political science because it required the fewest number of courses, which meant I could spread out and take as many other kinds of courses as I could. Went from there to got married, went to law school at the University of Florida. Did not really like law school, but in my family, the saying is you never quit. You always have to give something a good try. So I gave it a good try. I practiced law in various settings, including private practice and a lot of years in legal services. But that was not exactly something that was intentional. I had a daughter after graduating from law school who had a congenital enzyme deficiency, which meant that her bones would not grow, and she eventually died when she was 14 months old. So we went to Florida, my wife at the time and I, to a hospital, actually the hospital where I was born, where they were doing the only research in metabolic diseases at the time that there was in the world. And they thought that this was possibly a metabolic disease. It turns out it's not, but that's where we were. And I didn't feel like I could go to a law firm and say, you know, I'd like to practice with your firm. I'm only going to be here until my daughter dies. You know, that could be like 6 months or 14 months. Or so I thought, well, what I can do is I can work for legal services, have a good time practicing law. And when I leave, I could possibly transfer to another legal services office, and it would not put anybody out in a private practice. So I did that. When after Rebecca died, I moved back to Gainesville, Georgia, where I had been living and working, and started a legal services corporation in the Georgia mountains with a Vista volunteer who was in his junior year at Bolt Hall. And actually his story is kind of interesting because he graduated and became Justice Berger's law clerk.
Huh.
So that was kind of an interesting connection. Anyway, we stay in touch. Went from there to move back to Atlanta. Went to work for legal services, and then got a call one day from a friend in the law school here, Emory Law School, said, would you like to come teach here? So I did that for a couple of years. And that was kind of the last stop in the law train. While I was there, I could take courses for free. So I'd go over to the psychology department and say, let's see what this looks like. So I did that for a little bit and then decided it was time to make the move, applied to Georgia State University, and ended up spending the next 7 or 8 years there, getting an MA and a PhD in clinical psychology.
And then you took those two seemingly disparate careers and put them together.
Mhm.
Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, that was not an easy thing for me. I could not figure out how and where psychology and that education applied to law until I got into some therapy, and I said, let's work on just this issue. And so there are times when I would walk in, put on my lawyer's hat and talk about psychology, and other times when I'd go in, put on my psychology hat and talk about law. And it would just unleash ideas, and I would, write them on Post-it notes and put them on the wall. Pretty soon I had a wall full of notes with ideas about things I could do. And the therapist said, okay, now I want you to organize it as if you were going to write a book. So that was very helpful. And I came up with this notion that I could do several things that would help lawyers try cases. Because the one thing I did like about law was litigation. There was something in a trial that appealed to so many different interests that I had, including theater, communications, law, psychology, just storytelling. I mean, it was just every lawsuit is a story in and of itself, with
Right.
characters of all kinds. And so the first thing I did was go to psychologists, psychotherapists, friends, and say, I can possibly assist some of your clients who are having difficulty with lawsuits by explaining what the process is like to them, possibly being support for them. It was at the same time that our bodies ourselves was hitting the market.
Yep, I remember
And
that.
so so I thought, well, heck, I can assist women who are getting divorces, because I get on the elevator all the time and there's two lawyers talking about this woman that keeps calling me all the time she's got all kinds of issues. She just wants to have somebody to talk to, and they were talking about their clients in a really derisive way, they were helping to get a divorce. And their clients who I was working with were telling me they were placing phone calls to their lawyers to get some advice, and they weren't getting return phone calls. So I thought, okay, here's something we can do.
So that was a marrying of those two skill sets that you had.
Yeah.
But I think undergirding that is to do good.
Yeah, I guess so. It was helpful for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And then that kind of expanded out. So that became a service that we've offered for 40 years now, I guess, which is we call witness work.
Mm-hmm.
Some people call it witness preparation, but so witness work is a major part of what we do, including for witnesses and clients and anybody who's going to testify in a court case. And I've got a couple of good stories about that when it's time to tell you.
Whenever you're ready. So we kind of have come to where these two careers came together. And I know that you were involved in some very high profile cases, and perhaps now is a good time to give a little bit of a warning that we're going to get into some subject matter that might be difficult for some of our viewers. There's no way to talk about social justice issues without being somewhat uncomfortable. So if anybody might be squeamish, this might be the time to buzz out. Otherwise, let's proceed and talk about some of those cases and things that you were involved with.
Sure. And let me just say, in regard to the trigger warnings, that in the very first case, we had the question come up about whether this particular case, which involved the murder by a white Ku Klux Klanman of an African-American NAACP field secretary, whether we should try that case as a civil rights murder or as a murder.
Mm.
And so in that very first case, we did some research and discovered that it was, understandable by everybody. And everybody could be empathetic with a murder and the survivors of the murder. In this first case, particularly 2 small children and the wife. And so we tried all of the cases in that way.
As just murders
Mhm.
and not as civil rights murders.
Right.
Interesting.
Because they were famous people by that time, everybody knew what they were doing and why they were murdered, whether it was trying to get the vote, secure the vote for African Americans, or simply going to church one Sunday, which was the case with the 4 little girls. But everybody knew what was going on.
Can
So
you
we
tell
didn't
me?
have to talk about it.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that case? That was the case in Birmingham.
All right. Well, one day I got a call from a colleague, and he said the Attorney General of the state of Mississippi needs help, and this is the case. And he told me about a situation where a Klansman with an infield rifle had shot a man named Medgar Evers as Mr. Evers returned home from work with a box full of T-shirts that he was bringing home to hand out at various places about the voting rights. And he was standing there on the doorstep about to go in, his children hugging his legs, when bullets ripped through his body, and he was killed in Jackson, Mississippi. The man who did that was a man named Byron de la Beckwith. Beckwith was tried in state court at the time, but was acquitted because the jury was all white and was basically handpicked by a state agency in Mississippi called the Sovereignty Commission. Their mission was to make sure that the state stayed segregated. And state sovereignty, of course, was what it was all about. So they handpicked the jury, and Beckwith was acquitted. And so for the next, this was in 65, I think, 1965. And so for the next until 1994, he walked around a free man.
Mhm.
Yeah. And in law school, we knew about this. And it always puzzled me that this would happen. And I wondered how many more years it was going to be as the years passed before something was done about that case in particular. And so when I got that call, I just started vibrating. It was so historically important to me. And that I would be called on to assist out of the blue was just, wow, okay. Without having any idea what I was getting into, I said, sure, let's do this. So I went to Jackson, talked to the various prosecutors who were involved, and we got started. By the way, most of these cases have at least one movie associated with them. So I think this one is called Ghosts of Mississippi.
And maybe we can have a little collection of references at the end. Ghosts of Mississippi. All right.
Alex Baldwin, Whoopi Goldberg was Mrs. Evers. James Wood was Beckwith. Anyway, it tells the story if people, and pretty close to the facts, if anybody wants to get more information.
Cool. And
so
for that case, you were called, and what service did you render to the Attorney General's office that was trying this case again?
We did a community attitude survey and learned a lot of things about the Mississippians who were going to be called for jury duty. So an example would be we asked some open-ended questions so that people could answer however they felt whatever they thought. One question was, if your son or daughter asked you if they could bring a friend from the opposite race home for dinner, how would you respond? And people would say, not ever, wouldn't ever happen. Other people would say, what's the problem? They would come home for dinner. So you knew pretty quickly where people stood on that kind of issue. And then there were a lot of other questions that had to do with demographics, and so that we could correlate responses to the demographics. The first thing I always do in a case is get to know the clients. And so I spent some time with the prosecutors, spent some time with Ms. Evers, whose 95th birthday, I think, is this week. The interesting story about the case is the way it came up. Jerry Mitchell was a reporter for the Clarion Ledger, a young man who decided to dig into this particular case, and nobody knew where Beckwith was. Nobody could find the potential defendant. And so he went on a search for him, and he located him in Signal Mountain, Tennessee. And he called him and said, I'd like to come talk to you. And Beckwith said, sure, come on. People are generally cocky when they've been escaped the law for this long. And he was. And so Jerry drove to Signal Mountain, went in, and he said he started to feel a little queasy. He was by himself in Beckwith's home, his trailer, with his wife. He offered him a sandwich, and Jerry said he didn't know whether to take a bite out of the sandwich or not. Beckwith would later become very unfriendly to Jerry, but at this point he was open, I guess, to the publicity that was going to be involved. And as Jerry was leaving that day, he said he felt very odd walking away with his back to Beckwith, as he walked down the driveway and got into his car, not knowing whether he was going to get shot or not. But anyway, he took those kind of risks, started publishing the story day after day in the paper, and the paper happily let him do that. And so it got interest in the case up. And there was a young DA, Bobby DeLauder was his name, who started digging around for case records. And there had been I think either a fire or a flood in the Hinds County Courthouse at some point. And so all the records had been stored in a basement. And Bobby just dug, and found a box full of records. In that box was a trial transcript. And so it was like a script of the trial and how it happened and who the witnesses were and what they said. And so then the question was getting in touch with Ms. Evers to see if she would be willing to let this happen. And she was very untrustworthy at first, not knowing Jerry, but appreciating the fact that he was working hard to get this case tried. And
now was the original case was a criminal trial, I would assume, right?
Yes.
Now what was the second trial?
A criminal trial.
And how was it that it was tried again? What came forward that allowed that to happen?
There was never a guilty verdict in the first case. That's what shuts the door on double jeopardy. So Bobby found the transcript. He was married to, his wife was the daughter of a Supreme Court justice in Mississippi. And that Supreme Court justice had in his closet the Enfield rifle that Beckwith had used, because the first case had apparently gone to the Supreme Court at some point, or something had happened. And that evidence was in the case, and the justice decided he'd just hang on to it.
Wow.
So
that was Bobby a very lucky thing.
Yeah. And every one of the cases has something like that in it. I mean, they're just, miracles that fall out of the sky and make the case, remove an obstacle from the case and allow it to go forward. So then he got his district attorney, Ed Peters, to support him and to go along with it. And together they tried the case. They moved the jury selection to Panola County, which is north of Hinds County, because they didn't think they could get a fair jury in Hinds County. So they moved it to Panola County, which was half African-American and half Caucasian. And that's where we picked the jury.
And so, I mean, this is a very high profile case that you were involved in, and you already had done this work when you were in Florida. You know, you're starting to take this path that is in a very strong social justice direction at this point, you know, and it seems to me that you really feel strongly that this is a direction that you want to move in. Am I correct there?
Yes. I mean, it would be naive to suggest that we remove the social justice category from it and just say I was very interested in the dynamics of this case, because here was a criminal murderer who was just gallivanting around the country, and other ones would do it the same. I mean, these guys are so arrogant, it's unbelievable. Not only are they adolescent in their points of view, but they're just arrogant as they can be.
Well, they've been allowed to, you know, not have their reckoning. You know, they've got off scot-free, so they are arrogant. I think you are absolutely correct there.
Yeah.
And so you worked with the a prosecution on jury selection. Have I got that?
Yes.
Filtering through what would be jurors that you think would be open-minded and willing to render a fair verdict. Is that pretty?
Yes. Before that, we did basically structured the narrative. In other words, this is the way the case should start. Here's the middle, here's the end. These are the graphics, these are the photographs we think you should use, and this is why. The overall notion that drove the case was this notion about try a murder case. Don't make it into a social justice case, because then you're going to start upending people. They're gonna.
So really, you weren't framing it as a social justice case, even though that's what it was. But the frame you were putting around it was personal, in terms of people to invest in what it would be like if they put themselves in the shoes of Medgar Evers family members or whatever.
Exactly. Okay. Well said.
Okay. And then later on, I know that you were involved in another high profile case, the one about the killing of the 4 Black girls at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. Is that right? Can you tell me a little bit about that? And then I think I'm going to give a preview that you took these 2 careers and put them into another career. So we'll talk about that other case, and then we'll talk about where that led you next. How's that?
Okay. By this time, I had my interest, as you noted, was so great that I would have the lawyer I just worked with call the lawyer on the next case and say, I want to tell you what I think you need to do about calling Andrew Sheldon. So I just sort of linked it up, and I would do that through all 8 cases. And all along the way, you can feel this sort of group forming, this group of people who've had this experience already once or twice, and who then had expertise. And if you think about it from the point of view of the prosecutors, they had no expertise in dealing with cases of this kind of import and magnitude. So they were happy to have help. And so what my notion was, we sort of organize this helping crew that would come along, so you could, Doug Jones could call Bob Helfrich and say, what do you do here? And Bobby Lauder, what kind of, choices do I have here? Help me with those things. And so that was part of what I was doing in getting them to call all along the way. What I would do is I would read a story in the paper, and try to follow the cases as they went along. And when they got to a certain developmental stage, that's when I sort of insert myself into the mix. There was, I think most people know the story, and I think Spike Lee did the movie called Four Little Girls. And there was a lot of unrest in Birmingham. And there were what were called, finally toward the end, there were these things called children's marches. And the 16th Street Baptist Church was used as a launching point for the children's marches. And getting the children involved was a huge risk and a big deal. And as a matter of fact, when Bull Connor hauled out the hoses, they just pointed at the children as well as the adults. I think they arrested something like 3,000 or 4,000 children and put them, when the jail was too full, they put them in the local Coliseum, is what I think of it as. And so this was a church that was the focus, and there were lots of Birmingham churches that were having, African-American churches, as well as some white churches, that were having rallies and getting behind and supporting the civil rights movement at the time. So this was a Sunday, a children's service. And the pastor at the time was a man who actually retired and lived here in Atlanta. So we got to visit with him before we tried the case. His daughter was in the Sunday school that day too, Barbara, and she was injured as well, just not severely. The bomb went off, blew through a 2-foot thick rock wall into the ladies' dressing room, where the 4 little girls had gone, 5 little girls had gone to get ready to have the service that they were sort of in charge of. 4 of them were killed immediately, and one of them, the sister of one of the girls, was in the restroom so that she was slightly protected from the blast. Both of her eyes were damaged, but she ended up being only blind in one eye and is alive today. And the other 4 were, as the minister said, stacked like firewood on top of each other.
And
so
this ostensibly was just to send a message to the African-American community. Don't push too far, stay in your place. Is that correct?
That's all this violence is about, is that.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a means of oppression.
And so you worked on advising and consulting on the juries for this case as well.
This was actually 2 cases. There were originally 4 Klansmen in a car. One was tried. His name was called Dynamite Bob Chambliss. Dynamite is a big item in Birmingham because they have steel mines and they mine the ore, and it goes a long time. It's been the central to Birmingham's economy for years and years. And so Dynamite Bob Chambliss was a guy who was conversant with dynamite, and he was tried in 1977 by, at that time, the youngest district attorney in the country, Bill Baxley, and he was convicted. So the first one was in 1977, and there was a young guy who was in law school at the time named Doug Jones, and Doug would cut law school, go sit in the courtroom and watch. And so in 2000, he gets appointed U.S. attorney, not state's attorney, but United States attorney. And the first in his inbox, the first file is this file.
Wow.
So for the other two, one died, so that left these two, Tommy Blanton and Bobby Frank Cherry, sorry. And the FBI supervisor in charge was retiring that day, and he said, here's this file. You need to decide what you're going to do because time's running out. The witnesses are dying and ill, and if you're going to do something with this, you need to do it. And of course, it was a state crime. Murder was a state crime at the time. And so Doug had to get him and his staff specially appointed as state's attorneys in order to try the case, which meant he had to get Janet Reno's permission to do it. She was the AG at the time.
Right.
And she was very much in support of this. So as it's a first case where we actually got paid, and I called it the black helicopter syndrome because, I'd say we'd be on the floor in Doug's office and I'd say, Doug, this photograph is perfect. We need this photograph. And he'd hand it to somebody. And, in my mind, it was going off somewhere and came back, and it was this beautiful board. I'd never seen this done before, but, that's how behind the case the government was. So I know I skipped ahead a bunch, but the two cases, Bobby Frank Cherry filed a motion saying that he was incompetent to stand trial. And so the judge said, okay, we'll give you a competency hearing, send him to Taylor Hardin State Hospital, where he was evaluated by a psychologist there and found to be competent to stand trial. So, but by that time, Tommy Blanton had already been tried in the first trial. So the second trial was with Bobby Frank Cherry.
And the outcomes of those two additional trials?
Guilty.
And I guess this might be a bit of a segue. All of what you were exposed to, all the images, the footage, the thoughts, your sense of social justice, how did you process that? What did you do with that? And is that what informed your next career choice at some point?
Well, a couple of things. One is people would say, you ought to write a book. And I had no interest whatsoever in doing that. It seemed like a very lonely endeavor, very intellectual. And I knew that I was primarily an emotional person anyway. And that what was going on in me that was left over, what we call afterburn, I guess, was just sitting there. As is so often the case, I'll just let issues go, and they don't go anywhere, as you know. And so an image kept coming to me, and it was an image of, as a matter of fact, I don't know whether you can see it or not, but it's here. This is a drawing that I made of it.
Oh yeah, I was going to show that. Yes, it's very compelling. I could bring it up on the screen
Okay.
as well. Just a second, and then
Okay.
then maybe we can talk about it. So for the listener, there's a shift to art, and we'll talk about that. But let me see if I can bring up those images.
Well, while you're doing that,
There we go. So this is your, I don't know, booklet or brochure, Heartbreak and Healing, an Artist's Search for Justice. And I'm going to go to that image.
and it's
So there it is.
what's called an e-flip book, so that if you want to post at some point that
Yes, we will post the link at the end.
people could just go to it.
So this is titled Denise's Shoes. So was this one of Well, you tell me about this image.
Denise McNair was one of the 4 little girls. And these are her black patent leather shoes that she was wearing the day that she was killed. And the representation under it is supposed to be, doesn't look much like it, but it was supposed to be a piece of cement that was removed from her head by the medical examiner. And the blue thing behind it, the blue object behind it, is the blue shoebox. And this evidence was contained in that blue shoebox. And the prosecutor asked me if I would kind of take care of it, make sure it didn't get away from us. And so I did. I kept track of that. And so this image just would come up to me from time to time over the next 20 years. And as an indicator that, hello, we're still here. You need to deal with us in this. And I think the more I think about it, the more I think it was probably some form of PTSD. Because I would see, images of the 4 little girls on an anniversary of the trial, and I would just dissolve in tears, Still do it right now.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's one thing to talk about things in the abstract. It's quite another to be present for all that imagery, all that testimony, whatnot. And if it can have that effect on you, you can imagine what it has on the individuals that are in the periphery of what happened, the people that were in the building, the families, and whatnot.
Or just being African American in the culture, if this happens to them, it could happen to me. And oh my God.
Exactly. So do you want me to flip to one of the other images so we can talk about that, or do you want to talk about the process here a little bit more?
I just want to mention that those cases in the list on the other side of the cases. So we started out with Beckwith in 94, and then went to the Hattiesburg case in 96. And there were 2 there, 96 and 97. And the one in 97 ended up in a mistrial. There's a funny story about that too, which I'm just going to let go. And then Blanton was tried in Birmingham in 01 and Cherry in 02, all with guilty verdicts so far. Now, understand that in 94, we had no concept that we were going to get a guilty verdict in the Beckwith case. There was no way we were going to win that case. And that followed. Every time we got farther away from the incident in time, like from 93, 94, 63, 64, 65, we were moving farther and farther away from the incident. And when that happened, more and more witnesses would die, more get sick, or people would forget things. So it was going to get more and more difficult.
Right.
And so you can just almost see as you move from 94 to 07, there's going to be no chance with it, and yet each one came up with a guilty verdict. So I think of each one as kind of a miracle.
And do you think that part of it is just the social consciousness, but the shift in the understanding of civil rights and what was, I can't help but think of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, and so many different things that happened in that interval.
Mm-hmm. Sure,
So,
I think that's right. I also think that lots of people on these juries, because there were 8 juries in each case, lots of people on the juries were alive in 1963 and 64. And they're willing to step forward now at this point and do what needs to be done. And juries were, I would say, famously religious. All of these juries, one of the things I found out, and really was driven home in the Birmingham cases, I started to say that these people, meaning the people in Birmingham, were not religious, they were religion. And it's just a way of saying that was their very fiber of their being. So in trying a case, you need to think about, one needs to think about what kinds of attitudes and beliefs are going to drive the decision making in the jury. And in this case, it was clearly religious upbringing. So we very quickly began to think in those terms. People were thinking in terms of good and evil.
Yeah, and thou shalt not kill.
And thou shalt not kill. Absolutely correct.
Right.
And people are basically equal. Nobody deserves to be killed. Nobody who does these kinds of things should be allowed to roam free. Rather than what we were getting in 94 was, this just needs to be forgotten. Why bring this up now? Let bygones be bygones. You know, that really, with the case in 94, all of that flipped.
Okay. Let's see. You will know what's coming up next in the book. I'm going to flip to another image. So do you want to tell us about this? The
Sure.
one before of the shoes was a watercolor, am I correct?
Yes. Yeah, that was
And
just a
this
sketch.
Yeah, this looks like a oil or acrylic painting.
This is the first real painting in this collection. Now, this is a collection of 10 or 12 different paintings. One was on the cover.
Right.
And I don't know that I've talked about the transition to art, but at some point I decided it was time to retire. And what I wanted to do was to take up painting. So I took a couple courses and one thing led to another. And finally, I got to a point where I felt like I could paint well enough to actually paint some pictures. And a friend said, why don't you paint a picture that relates to each one of the cases? Then you wouldn't have to write a book. And I said, sounds like a good idea. So this is the point at which I'm still representational. There's nothing impressionistic. There's nothing imaginary about this. This actually happened. I was sitting in the courtroom with a small, it was back in the early days of small video cameras. And I was bound and determined from here on out, when I was involved in these cases, to get some photographs. So I basically put that camera in my briefcase and got it through security because I walked right behind Doug Jones, who's in the picture, and we got through with it. Anyway, the lady in the wheelchair is the same woman who's in the front row in the courtroom with a white shawl around her neck, sort of looking at her hands. That's Mrs. Robertson. She was the mother of Carole Robertson. And we wanted, and by the way, as you go across, you go all the way to the other end and you see Chris and Maxine McNair, Denise's parents. And then behind Mrs. Robertson is the editor of the New York Times, and sitting next to him is an author who wrote a lot. So it was important for Mrs. Robertson to come and testify in her daughter's trial, basically, a trial about the death of her daughter. And so Doug and I would go. Doug Jones is the United States Attorney at the time, and I would go over and visit with Mrs. Robertson. She was very cordial, very nice. She came out in her wheelchair and sat on her front porch, but she was not well. And she thanked us very much and said she was not going to do that. She was not going to testify. She was not well. She'd done it already once, and it took a great toll on her. And she didn't think there was any chance of success. And so she wasn't going to do it. So we went away disappointed and resolute to go ahead and do what we needed to do in the case. A couple of weeks later, we decided to try again. We went back, did the same thing again, had the same result. And so it's the day of trial. Trial opens and it's maybe 10, 11 o'clock. Things are just getting underway. And I looked around and here comes Mrs. Robertson with her, I think it was her nephew, wheeling her into court in a wheelchair.
I just got chills just now.
Yeah. And so she came down, and as she got closer to midway and where my camera was, I pulled my camera up and I said, Doug, and I pointed to her, and he went and he came back, and this is what you saw was him reaching down and hugging Mrs. Robertson and welcoming her to court. So I decided that would be a good place to start with paintings. And I messed around a little bit. The jury box was not behind her like it is in the painting. But she was, her person was so solid and so wonderful that I ended up telling Doug that I felt like she was the center of the universe, the moral center of the universe. And so I put this into the title of it. It's called The Heart of the Matter, and did it all in this gold leaf frame because I wanted it to eventually end up in Doug's office, because by this time he was Senator Doug Jones from Alabama. And so that's why it has that brass plate on it. And I did get to take it up there and had lunch. Ann went, my wife went with me. We had lunch in the Senate dining room, and it was wonderful. We had a good time. He still has it.
Super. All right, let's see what you've got. Now this image is very difficult to look at. Can you tell me about it?
Mm-hmm. I started to understand that some of the feelings that I had were about people who are unaware. I know I was at some point unaware. But at this point I was thinking, people have to be aware of what's going on, of what went on, what still goes on. I mean, what goes on today. And so this is a representation to me. It's called An Ordinary Day, with just a month picked at random, with entries on it that would be, just sort of everyday entries like book club, dentist, bridge club, pool cleaners are here, things like that. And in front of it, of course, are these three hanging figures. And to me, it's a representation of the lack of awareness.
I mean, for me, it's like going about your business and thinking of these human beings who are invisible unless you're confronted in this way with them. Otherwise, it's business as usual, an ordinary day.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And, some people are pretending that it doesn't exist, and some people just don't know. And I can't tell the difference. This newspaper clipping is kind of interesting in terms of my evolution, because it was the first time that I realized that the terrorism in the United States was not unlike the terrorism in the rest of the world, because the Journal-Constitution, the Atlanta paper, has these two articles on the front page. On the right hand is a story about Osama bin Laden, terror suspect he's called. It says now it's war. And on the left is the guilty verdict in the Bowers case, which was the case in Hattiesburg that I mentioned before. And so I thought, oh yeah, exactly. How come I separated?
Yeah.
Yeah. How come I separated that in my mind? It's not different. As a matter of fact, I developed a PowerPoint that is about 34 slides long. It's the state of Mississippi, and it's got a red arrow. I have a record of 6 months, 5-6 months of Klan violence in Mississippi. So I go through it day by day, and I circle a red around an area where it happened, and then it pulls out to the description of what happened on that day in that place. Then it goes to the next one. There's about 4 per slide. Well, by the time you get to slide 30, the whole state's looking pretty red. So just another way of depicting the amount of violence that was going on, and imagining what it must have been like to have lived in that situation.
Okay, I'm gonna Now this is
a viper.
a viper.
This is Edgar Ray Killen, who was the leader of the murder of the 3 civil rights workers in Philadelphia, Mississippi. You may remember that it's fairly common knowledge that that's where President Reagan went to announce his campaign for some reason, Philadelphia, Mississippi. Interesting place. Preacher Killen was a lumberman. He was, in fact, a preacher. I don't know whether it was a lay preacher or actually ordained, but he lived in a part of Forest County, which is, by the way, named for Nathan Bedford Forrest, the originator of the Klan. Lived in a part of Forest County that was a pretty rough part. He was a pretty rough guy. About 3 months before the trial in Philadelphia, he was trying to dislodge a tree from the crotch of another tree, and it fell on him, hit him right on the top of the head, broke both of his femurs, just shoved him into the earth like that. He went to the hospital and he was out in a week in a wheelchair, up and ready to go in another couple of weeks. I mean, just a tough old bird. But he was like this. He personified evil to me. And that's something that I really wanted to
Portray.
I really want, to portray. And this is the best I could do with it. Part of this is a judgment call. There are lots of ways to portray evil. And this was probably the least offensive. I didn't want to totally, get people just to shut the book at this point or walk away. And so this is the image I chose.
Yeah, it's quite disturbing.
It comes from he was being wheeled into court one day, and a news photographer, because the news people were all over him, news photographer put up his camera like this and Killen spit at him.
Oh.
And that, to me, that's what vipers do.
Yeah. Okay. And
the second thing I was interested in who attended lynchings. It's the carnival-like atmosphere is often mentioned. The fact that fathers would bring their children and mothers and all of these. This picture is actually taken from a real lynching in Marion, Indiana in 1930. And all I did was paint it and block out the lynched figures because I didn't want to pay attention to them. I wanted people to start to ask, did my relatives participate in this kind of thing? Was my grandfather there? We had done some work in various sections of Georgia where we had what we call reconciliation meetings, where people from both sides of the issue would come together and begin to talk with each other. And I remember a young man who was on a panel saying that he went with his dad into Woolworths, and when they came out, they were talking to a couple guys, and his dad said, "Yeah, I did that," meaning that his father, in front of his son, was admitting to participating in a lynching in Watkinsville, Georgia.
I have to tell you that this image reminds me of I was in a small German village where my ancestors came from back in the 1700s, and we met with the clergy person of this particular church, and he led us to an outside covered area, kind of an alcove, and it had a huge mural on it. And it was the idealization of the Aryan race in Nazi Germany. It had all these villagers and various political figures. And he told us that the congregation wanted to paint over it, didn't want that evidence to remain of what had happened in the historical past. and he insisted that it be preserved. And it just really, this gives that same feeling to me,
Mhm.
particularly
Mhm.
that one figure that almost, the one that's pointing, that could be easily taken for an Adolf Hitler type of figure
Mm.
there.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
And so this second painting is again looking at uh, the onlookers, and is that a burning figure that I'm seeing in the
Mhm. Yeah,
foreground?
that's the man who was lynched.
Okay.
They didn't just stop with hanging people. They would, while they were hanging, shoot the bodies full of bullets. They would cut them down and chop them into pieces and give the pieces out as souvenirs. Photographers would make postcards, and people would buy the postcards and send the postcards. It was just I mean, for the lynching that happened in Noonan, Georgia in 1947, maybe, there were a couple carloads full of people that came from Atlanta just to go down there to watch it happen.
Hmm.
It was a major event. And this is, again, the faces are just of various different people from different classes. The two figures over on the left-hand side are dressed up. It maybe not as clear in this, but they're dressed up like they're going to a carnival, or like they're in a carnival. Mhm.
Hmm. So is this the same individual here?
No, things are out of place in this one.
Okay.
And so I'll need to fix this. This is Ben White. Ben White was a sharecropper in Natchez. He was extremely poor. When they found his body, his shoes were wrapped in baling wire just to keep them together. His parents, I think, had been slaves and were freed, and Ben was a sharecropper on the same property where they had been slaves, if I got that correctly. Three Klansmen came by in a car looking for an African-American to kill. They saw Ben out in the field, called him over, told him they wanted to go find a lost dog in the Homachita National Forest, and would he be willing to do that for some pay? He said certainly. Got in the back seat, and they went to the forest, and on the way they stopped and got some pop, and then went on to the forest, and then came to a stop, and the passenger got out of the front seat and came around, opened the door, and shot him so many times the medical examiner said he couldn't count them all. And then he got the driver, a man named Ernest Avance, to come around and do the same thing with a shotgun. And so basically they just blew Ben's head off at that point. The driver was the man left alive that we could prosecute. In the original trial, the driver's lawyer had argued that Mr. White was already dead when Mr. Avance shot him, and you can't kill a dead man, so you should find him not guilty, and they did.
Hmm.
So
And
Ben was, the notion was that Ben was supposed to be bait, to the publicity about his murder would bring Dr. King into the state, and then they could get Dr. King.
And the kind of ghost-like figures in the background, do you want to tell me more about them?
Yeah, so do you know about Stone Mountain?
I think I do, but I'll let you.
Okay. Well, we have a large granite mountain outcropping, not too far outside of Atlanta, probably a 20-minute drive. And there's a carving on it by the same sculptor who did
Mount
the
Rushmore?
Mount Rushmore. I think he died before he finished Mount Rushmore, and his son finished it. But at any rate, these are the Confederate generals.
That's what I
and
thought.
yeah, just marching, and I made them vacant-eyed, they are anyway, but marching the other way in front of Ben.
Wow. And then let's see, is there that one could be of today, I think. This one, Portrait of Fear and Rage.
Probably. This was this was in, my studio was at home when I had this up. And by this time I was getting so angry that my wife was noticing, and she was saying, you know, you're getting kind of morbid. Do you know that? And I said, well, I certainly feel that way. And so I decided it was probably time for me to get this stuff out of the house. So at that point, I rented a studio and took all of this there and finished it there. But it was a good thing to do. But I would just, when I thought about the people that did this and learned about the different things that they do, it was just like, you know, you could, a compendium of ways to be violent, and it would just go on and on. I mean, it never stopped. Just any way you could think of to hurt another person, these people were into. And things like throwing acid on the seat of somebody's car. So when they got in to drive away, the acid would burn them, or just throwing it on them anyway.
It's it's a really distasteful part of our history that we tend to try to keep it about an arm's distance or flip through and not confront. Your images are haunting.
When I started out, there's a statue in Birmingham of a policeman with a dog. It's a bronze statue, and the dog is just, you know, just like this, lurching out. And I think most everybody probably has heard that story about the marches in Birmingham with the children and the policemen unleashing their dogs. But what I want to do is turn it around a little bit so that I had the policeman and his dog, but his dog was attacking a Klansman. And that turned out to be a confusing image. People did not really understand what I was getting at, and I wasn't sure I was clear either. At this point, I was just so angry that there wasn't a lot that was clear to me. Mostly I was confused, I think, and angry. And so I, for the third time, painted over that, but I left the, you can basically up in the top right-hand corner, you can see the hat of the policeman.
Right here.
Yeah. And I left that in because the police were involved. You know, it was told to me during the Birmingham trials that half the Birmingham police force was in the Klan. So you'll see that again in the next image. There you see one of the two shooters is a policeman.
Right there.
And the way this image is supposed to work is that it's a triptych, so that you originally walk up into the middle one, and you're supposed to see what the three boys were confronting when they looked behind them in the rearview mirror and they saw the oncoming cars that Preacher Killen had summoned to capture them. They were on the way back to Philadelphia from, I think, a meeting in Meridian, Mississippi, because they'd heard that the church was being burned. And so they were driving back. They were waylaid on this dark road in Mississippi, taken out, shot, and buried in a levee. I'm sorry. There is a fairly famous painting done by Norman Rockwell that depicts their exhumation, their killing in the levee.
I mean, looking at those images, I am putting myself in the position of a Black male African American, and you know, the fearing for your life. It's maybe different than it was then, but not as different as one would like to think.
Yeah, I think it's still possible to go places and be scared in the same way.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And then the other one, this is
This is a compilation. That's a
anguish.
compilation.
Yes, the
Yes.
anguish.
Yeah. And that's where I was by this time. It was just all of the feelings that I'd had up to this point kind of resolved into this sadness and depression and grief, which I can get readily into right away. This Murley Evers on the right, that's Medgar in the casket. That's Denise McNair, and I think her cousin over here on the left side, and I believe that's Carole Robertson's mom wailing in the background.
Mm.
And so this is me after when
Mhm.
I'd sort of gotten to the bottom of it all. He's got brushes in his hand, so he's a painter, and behind him are the shoes again and the piece of cement from the original sketch. And by this time, I just didn't know which end was up and which way was how I was going to get out of this. So I began to call on my two sons, both of whom are artists. One's a musician and one's actually a painter, to ask them about the process. And they were both very, very helpful. Everybody I talked to was helpful. I
mean, it's obviously a lot to work through. It reminds me when you mentioned earlier about the PTSD. My father, my grandfather, my father was in World War II. My grandfather was in World War I and World War II, and it was only after my father passed that I learned some of the horrors of what he went through, and it was very difficult, and I wasn't there, so I think it's a lot. I don't know, was there a way that you healed from all this, Andy?
I think so, but let me speak to that just for a second, if I could. That really speaks to the concentric circles. And that's an image that I have somewhere, but that I never painted. It's like throwing the proverbial stone in the pond, and the effects it have just go out and out and out. So you can imagine the children of the grandfathers who were lynched, of the people that are walking around today. I have a good friend whose name is Lisa McNair. She's Denise's sister. She was not born when Denise was killed. She was born a couple of years later. And she's written a book called Dear Denise, Letters to My Sister.
Mm.
And she goes around the country talking. She says, for years, I felt saddled by this legacy. I didn't even know her. And yet everywhere I went, people were asking me about her. And she said, finally, I just came to grips with the fact that I guess it's my destiny to talk about Denise. And so that's what she does.
Yeah, they call it intergenerational trauma.
Yes, exactly.
And we even have DNA that little tags that may carry some of that. This would go for people who survived the Nazi internment camps and other serious traumas like that.
Yes, yes. So I titled it Heartbreak and Healing. In the healing part, my wife Ann was helpful in identifying. She says that there's a time that's called the settling time. And that's just a time where you need to just sit with it and just let the healing happen. So that's very much what's happened. It's no longer an image that comes to my mind. I can obviously still, without any effort, some of the emotion that goes with it. But I think that's as it should be.
Mhm.
It should be a time that, and a series of events in our history that just is so traumatic. And until it is that, I think we're not going to make the kind of movement that we need to make or do the kind of healing that we need to do. I always felt like that before the country could move from out of adolescence into the next stage of nationhood, we needed to heal the Native American problem, issues, and this issue. And then perhaps we could make some moves. But, there are always other issues too.
Yeah, I'm gonna stop the screen share and go back and yeah, it seems like right now we're grappling with having had a period of healing, and then the face of evil seems to be rearing its head, and sometimes it's hard to make sense of how we could go back to a less enlightened time. I don't think we ever made it completely out of the woods to the healing part, and now we're back grappling with it again. And maybe that's part of the human condition, that we constantly circle back around and revisit the sins of the father again and again. And
Yeah, we have all kinds of denial mechanisms that are just so firmly in place we don't even think about them. Like, who wants to dwell on this?
right,
Well, nobody wants to, but I mean, we wouldn't have to if it didn't happen, but it did happen. So, let's grow up and talk about it.
right. Well, I'm very moved by your paintings and by what you've done, and I think for any of our Sheldon family listeners, this is an insight not just into you as a person and our collective, genealogical history, but also our humanity, and what we can either choose to turn away from, or we can choose to confront. So I really, really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today. And I hope that the people that take the time to view this will find it enlightening and helpful. Thank you.
Terrific. Yeah, you're welcome. There's no reason why the Sheldons can't be the leaders,
Absolutely. And as I told you, I have a great grandfather who was active in the Underground Railroad. Sheldon. And so, yeah, we all have to do our part one way or the other. Thank you, Andy.
Yeah, thank you very much. I very much appreciate you guys taking the time to do this on a holiday, Memorial Day. It's kind of
Perfect.
appropriate.
Yeah, how appropriate indeed.
Yeah,
all right.
yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Can I say something before we go? It's so much fun for me, that you guys are providing. I really, really, really appreciate it. Well, that was the second part to my goodbye.
Yeah.
Just incredible. Well, okay, let you guys go.
Andy, I just appreciate your willingness to share, and I mean, as a psychologist, as an artist, to really make us dig deep. So, anyway.
Thank you. My first goal was to just use it for myself as art therapy, I guess. But my second goal, once I'd finished with it, was to spread the word, to get it out to as many places and as many people as I could. I never expected that the Sheldon genealogy site would be the way it start to spread, but that's fine. That's a good thing. Love you guys.
Take care. Bye.
See you.